this video, I'm going to be discussing the faith of the Mexicans, the faith of the people of Mexico, which is a faith that correlates to the feathered serpent. And this faith is deeply rooted in a biblical teaching which serves and loops into the story of what happens in Mexico. Which, now that you understand faith, which is the power and also your curse, it is your strength just as much as your weakness. And so let's analyze the faith of Mexico. In Palenque, the ancient Mayan city, where in this ancient city, where time was created, where time began, is a particular temple. And in this temple, known as the Temple of the Cross, which, oddly enough, Christ had not been. But as we continue, let me endue this thought to you. At the Temple of the Cross, the symbolism of the Temple of the Cross is meant to represent the tree of creation. And at the top of that temple is meant to be an eagle perched. The temple is meant to represent the tree of creation. At the top of that temple in Palenque is meant to be an eagle perched. Now, when you look at their actual faith, their symbol is the feathered serpent, which means they follow the snake, temptation. And the reason that at the Temple of the Cross, at the place where time began, at the tree of creation, with the eagle perched in Palenque, where time began, is where the power of the Mexican came from. Because at the top of that tree is the eagle. And what is the very symbol of the Mexican flag? An eagle capturing a snake, which is actually meant to represent the story of when the king that built Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. The reason Tenochtitlan was built at the lake, in the center of the lake that it was, and became a city more beautiful than Venice at the time that it had existed, almost 700 years ago. And in this city, the reason this king chose for that particular location to be where the capital of the Aztec Empire was going to be was because an eagle perched a snake out of the water at that very lake. Now let's think back to the Temple of the Cross, representing the story or the tree of creation with the eagle perched at the top of the tree, right? What were the Spaniards essentially? Their acquisition or inquisition. You see, at Tenochtitlan is where the Aztecs were defeated and plucked out from the water by the great bird, the eagle. Which the eagle is oftentimes the most sacred bird because it has such great vision. Now, when Cortez saw through to this culture and deemed it demonic, he was technically outnumbered at that point. They were sacrificing 20,000 people a day. Cortez only had him and a handful of men at that point. When they met Moctezuma II, where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the day that it was predicted for Quetzalcoatl to return. Do you see how if you focus on me right now, you can kind of see Mexico in the background? Focus on me. Do you see now that the moment that Moctezuma met Cortez on his daily walk, on that day was predicted the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And on that day is when Cortez bumped into Moctezuma randomly. And Moctezuma, never having seen a horse in his life, let alone a man in a steel armor suit, sitting on top of that horse. Do you know what that kind of power would be? To strike fear in the Aztec king's life? Do you know how much power that would create for the others around Moctezuma, the ruler of this Aztec empire? To all of a sudden see him afraid. It began their deception. And oddly enough, Moctezuma believed he was the return of their god. Please, you must come with me to my city. Now, imagine this. Imagine when Cortez first enters the long bridge, about a kilometer long, into the lake, where they built a floating city in the middle of a lake called Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. When they arrived at the main plaza in front of Templo Mayor, the 144 steps up the pyramid were painted red. And I'm not talking about a staircase this big. I'm talking about, you know, the pyramid in Giza? Not the big one. That one. Yeah, that's how big those pyramids were. And in order to climb those pyramids, you have to run. But you can't run in a straight line because it's so steep. Because these pyramids are not like the Giza pyramids. They're not tall like the Giza pyramids based on their base, allowing them to have that height. They're extremely narrow, these pyramids. They were platforms. And at this pyramid, which was still relatively quite big, but very tall and very steep, the only way you can climb those stairs is by running and changing direction on each step, which as you climb, you are actually creating a Kundalini motion, a genetic pattern, you could say, a helix pattern, climbing up to the top of that platform, a place of magic, which at the pyramid, at the beginning, at the Temple of the Cross, representing the tree of creation, the tree of knowledge, which Tenochtitlan was built because the eagle perched on a tree came and snagged the snake, which meant this was a place of power because it meant the tree was close. And now when you see that the Temple of the Cross, which was technically not in any particular way a symbolization towards Christianity or Catholicism, the Temple of the Cross is essentially at the place they find their creation is where they also found the eagle that came and plucked them from the lake. In that same sense, who do the Aztecs revere in their culture? The eagle warrior, which is a rank above the jaguar warrior. And then these different types of warriors had different, you could say, hexes. Because in the jungles, if you look like an animal, you might as well be one. And when you look at now the representation of this faith, which is that somehow at the moment of creation is where the cross of vision being seen for who they were. And that cross at the Temple of Palenque, at the Temple of the Cross, could be said to be a foreshadowing in the spell and incantation of the story of the faith of Mexico, which is a eagle plucking the snake off of the lake. Now, let's analyze symbolistic animals, you could say, spirit animals. Because there's not just one culture that did this, but a lot of cultures did this. You see, in indigenous culture of North America, for example, you enter spirit animals, right? But what did these spirit animals represent if they were not, in fact, you could say, the disciple that particular person was born from? Whether he was the disciple of Bear, a big man, or disciple of Wolf, strong in his pack. And now when you look at things like when you enter, as an example, in Egypt, where you see Anubis with the head of a jackal, and Anubis is meant to represent the lord of the underworld. And why is he a jackal? Because a jackal actually has a laugh that sounds a lot like this. It sounds like it's hackling at you. That was a poor example. Anyways, it literally sounds like it has an evil laugh. That is what a jackal is. Now let's look at Horus as an example. Once again, a falcon, a bird in the sky, which means it requires vision. And as this bird, Horus, is blind in one eye after a battle with Seth. And Horus becomes blind, essentially. He only sees half the truth. But he can only see that half of the truth. Because in the eye he is blind, he cannot see the darkness anymore. It's just white light. He's blind now. And so, what do spirit animals and faith represent? Well, you see, an animal is a humanistic creature. It's a mammal. And in a exchange of, you could say, affection with an animal, when you meet eyes with an animal, you're actually giving that animal your intelligence when you teach it to be able to sit still so you can touch the damn thing. But each animal has its own characteristic, which makes it unique in the behavior that they are. Now let's look at the 13 disciples, which I would argue a disciple, which means a student of a particular master, which a master also doesn't necessarily mean one particular master. It could mean 12 particular masters that are meeting in front of the 13th. And now, what are the disciples? They are the initial type of body types that each individual shade of the decoloration of the human skin. You see, there is everyone that first started at the beginning of time, beyond Adam and Eve. Because in order to recreate that story, you need people. And by the time Cain and Abel were there was already people. And so now, where do we go from that point? Well, in terms of the Mexicans, or the Mexican faith, the very symbol at the temple of the cross where they're not just there, but time in the universe, where time in the universe started at this very ancient city, is where the cross presented itself. The animalistic, what's that J.K. Rowling thing they call it? Affix? A cruxus? Can't remember. Didn't read it. But anyways, what I was going to say is, an animal enhances your faith, because you are now giving yourself a protector, a guardian spirit under your faith that is now channeling through you. And as it channels through you, you are now channeling yourself to either your companion, your friend, your lover, or back to God. Creating the 4 types of love known in Greek. Thank you, everyone.